Hello, welcome back. So, as part of the data modeling masterclass series, we are bringing up one more video that is regarding uh, primary key versus surrogate key, and this is again a part of key elements of logical data modeling that we have been discussing in the previous videos. And this is again like for beginners who are just learning about the SQL and the data modeling. So this is again a key important. So if you are at advanced level also, there might be sometimes confusion about when to use surrogate key, when to use primary key. So people technically know what is primary key and surrogate key, but so sometimes there will be confusions which one to choose in what scenarios, right? So those kind of things we will discuss in detail. So what is exactly primary key and what is the surrogate key? What are the advantages of using primary key and surrogate key? What are the disadvantages? And when to use what, right? And we will take a example and we will try to explain how exactly we can create a primary key and surrogate key in different databases, right? So if you are new to this channel, before proceeding, we would recommend you to please subscribe and also press bell button for instant notifications. So let's get started. So primary key versus surrogate key, right? So in database design, both primary key and surrogate key plays crucial roles in basically uniquely identifying records within a table. So both does the same, right? So even when you talk about primary key or surrogate key, so both are the main intention of both of the keys is uniquely identifying records within a table, right? But the difference is they have a distinct characteristics and use cases. That is where it is important to understand in detail what are the use cases, what are the characteristics of primary key and surrogate key, right? So let's discuss about primary key. So primary key is a column or a combination of columns that uniquely identifies each rows in a table. So this is important, right? Like suppose what we are talking here is it might be a column or combination of the columns. Okay, suppose there is a table here, right? And there is a, say for example, product ID, right? So product ID might be there and product category also might be there. Okay, so sometimes just by product ID we might not able to uniquely identify a particular records in a table, right? So then what we do is we might combine with the product ID with product category or product ID with say location, right? So we might use multiple columns as a combination. So that might help us uniquely identify a record. So end of the day, so it might be one key or one column or multiple column. So the definition of primary key is so we that particular column or a combination of columns should help us uniquely identify a row. Okay, so if it is not able to identify uniquely, then it will never be called as a primary key, right? And it is chosen from the actual data in the table, right? Because so how exactly the primary key is chosen? So it is based on the data, right? Because if the only column one is sufficient, the product ID is sufficient, so then we might not need other columns as a combination to make it as a primary. So it wholly depends how the data is organized in the table, right? And that also help that actually that is the main criteria to decide what is the primary key and how exactly we need to define a primary key, which column need to be defined as a primary key, right? And so what are the characteristics? But definitely we have a uniqueness and we have a non-nullability. So uniqueness is nothing but each value in the primary key column must be unique across the table. So that we have already seen, right? So each column should be able to primary key must be able to across the table, so it should be uniquely able to identify records. And what is non-nullability? So primary keys cannot and never be null, because if the primary key itself is null, so then what's the point, right? So we cannot uh, that is not at all eligible for to be a primary key. So because so if it is null, so how do you really identify a particular record? It is not possible, right? And the next characteristic is of primary key is meaningful. So you cannot choose a random key as a primary key, right? So you need to have like some logic or some meaningful primary keys are derived from actual data and often carry business meanings. Suppose it might be like social security number, Aadhaar number, right? You might choose to have some kind of employee number, right? So there would be some ID, say here some serial number, right? So just without any meaning, you cannot use that serial number as a uniquely identifying column. So it should have a meaning actually, like a employee ID, customer ID. If it is a customer table, it should have customer ID. If it is having a product, it is a product table, it should have a product ID, right? So that's important. It should be meaningful as well, right? And natural key. So primary key is also called as a natural key. So don't get confused. What is a primary key and natural key? Both are the same. Often a natural key or a primary key, which means it comes from the data itself and has a logical relationship to the data it represents. So it has a logical relationship, right? Like because here if you have an employee table and then there is a salary table, so there is a logical relationship. So in salary table also you have an employee ID. So these salary and employee table are linked to each other, right? So that which it comes from the data itself and has a logical relationship with the different datas. So that should help in logically connecting the different tables. So that also is key, right? And that is why we are calling it as a natural key. Okay. And what are the different pros and cons of using the primary key is if you want to really see. So what are the pros are like provides a natural way to identify records uniquely since the key has an inherent meaning. Okay, because employee ID is having an inherent meaning, right? Employee ID means it is a ID to identify a particular employee. So if there is a product ID, so it is a ID for a product to uniquely identify a product, right? And no need to introduce an additional column for identification if a natural key is used. That's quite obvious, right? Because if employee table is already having an employee ID, so I need not have a column. I need not create a new column to uniquely identify a particular records because employee ID will obviously be unique. So that's why it's a natural key. What are the cons of using it? So sometimes there might be changes in the business process or the data might require changes in the primary key, which can be complex. So say for example, like product ID, they might be using as so in the current system, product ID, product table will be there. And for each product ID, they might be having some naming convention as PR underscore 001, right? PR underscore 002, PR underscore 003, something like this, right? And with a new process or the new business, so they might say like, I don't want to use PR. Instead of that, I just want to use 001 underscore location ID. 002 underscore location ID. So that means the ID underscore location ID. So location ID might be 123 whatever. So they want to choose this as a primary key. So that's a business decision or some business use case they want to change. So then it might be complicated because um, see this is a product table, right? So and this product table might be linked to customer table and it might be linked to order table, right? So if you want to really change the primary key and then it is not so simple, it is quite quite a bit of operations to kind of change it everywhere in the because this is dependent, right? Primary keys are being used as a foreign key in other tables, so there is a lot of complexity involved. So if the primary key is large or composite, it can lead to inefficient in indexing and querying. So again, so this is what is primary key is large, right? So primary key large means there might be like 10 million or 20 million or 1 billion records, right? Say for example, in a particular transaction table, and you are uniquely identifying a transaction table with a transaction ID, but since it is having nearly 1 billion records, so it can lead a inefficiency when they're indexing or querying that particular table using that primary key, right? That would be another con of using primary keys. So now let's take example of a primary key, right? So if you see when taking a SQL DDL as an example, that means create table as an example. So where I want to create a products table, say for example, right? And what exactly I'm using here is, so I'm using a SKU view. SKU is a, like, you can take it as a product ID, right, to uniquely identify that product. And then I will define a data type, what exactly data type I need, and I'm defining a keyword called primary key. So this is a keyword to define a primary key in SQL. But if you are using MySQL, or if you are using post post uh, PostGRE SQL or whatever, right? So different kind of a SQL systems, RDBMS systems, so the syntax might slightly vary. But end of the day, so it is how, like, you define a primary key, and we already also call it as a natural key. And other columns will be as is, like you can define a number of columns, that doesn't matter. But this is what, at least one table, each of the table that you have defined in RDBMS, it should have at least one primary key, right? And coming to next, surrogate key. By definition, the surrogate key is an artificially created key. So usually an integer that uniquely identifies each row in a table. So why we are telling it as an artificially created key? Because so if you take about product ID, right? So product ID is not actually artificially created. So it might be created, there might be some user interfaces where whenever there is a new product getting added into the inventory, so they will make an entry of that product ID, right? In the UI interface, right? Or whenever there is a product getting added, so during that time, newly product will be, product ID will be generated. But here in this case, it is not that way, right? It is not derived from the actual data in the table, but is generated by the system, right? So that means whenever there is a new entry into that particular table, so system will generate a ID to that particular row to uniquely identify. So what are the advantages, and like, what are the characteristics basically, right? So characteristics is, again, so we have seen uniqueness in the previous primary key scenario. Here also it is, like, primary key, surrogate key also must be unique. So that is one of the key characteristics of surrogate key as well. And this is also, surrogate keys cannot be null. So because these are also like a primary key which are used to identify uniquely the records. But the main differentiator is, here the surrogate key is artificial and meaningless. Surrogate keys basically have no business meaning, so they are purely from the identification, for the identification purpose. For example, auto increment integers or something, auto increment whenever there is a new product getting added, or new transaction is getting added in the transaction table, you just give some auto incremented value. Suppose there is a first transaction, it is assigning 1. For second transaction, it will be assigning automatically 2. So uh, there is no control from whatever the process that you are making the entry into the table. So system will take care of assigning that value. So that is why we call it as a system generated. And typically surrogate keys are generated by the database management system, that is RDBMS. Like if you are using SQL, MySQL, or PostGREs, whatever, SQL, whatever you're using. So you might be using Vertica DB, IBM, whatever databases, whatever RDBMS that systems you are using. So each, almost all the systems have the concept of surrogate key. So you can, but the syntax might slightly vary, but you can still use any of the RDBMS and make any column as a surrogate key and use it. So again, what are the pros and cons? Surrogate keys are immutable. That means surrogate keys do not change over the time, even if the underlying data changes. So that is again one of the key aspect, because uh, they are generated by the system, and there is no control over that. Okay, and that is one of the advantage of it. And efficiency, often smaller or the more efficient for index and joins, particularly when using integers as a surrogate key. And it also simplifies the relationship between the tables, especially in cases where natural keys are complex or composite. So when you want to, like, say for example, there is a scenario where you are not able to uniquely identify a particular column as a primary key. So in that case, you struggle to identify a primary key, right? So maybe you will try to take 2 to 3 columns combination to make it as a composite primary key, right? And that might complicate, and that might sometimes add to the performance issues, because you're whenever you are doing any join operations or any kind of operations related to this primary key, so it might lead to the performance issue, because every time it has to take the combination of 3 columns, right? So instead of that, in that case, surrogate key can be helpful in terms of giving much better performance as well, and it is more simple in that cases. And when do you, what are the cons, right? So no inherent meaning makes it harder to understand the data by just looking into the key. Because see, like whenever you see a product transaction table or a product table which is having a surrogate key, right? It will just keep on adding the values like 1 2 3 4, like till 1000, 10,000, whatever. So there is no naming convention, there is no ID convention, there is nothing. But if you're using, in case of a primary key or natural key, you can have a combination of some, or some naming conventions, right? Like suppose a product from a particular country can start with 100 and then followed by some value, right? So that will help you uniquely identify, or by looking at that particular record, if it is starting by 100, you can uniquely identify that. Okay, you might think that, okay, you can think that, okay, it belongs to a particular country or whatever, right? So it has some, you can create some meaning for primary key. But here in case of surrogate key, that is not possible, because it doesn't, it is generated by system and you cannot control that, and it requires additional column. So surrogate key, we need to install a, we need to put another column into the particular table, introduce an additional column that needs to be maintained. And if you're talking about billions of transactions, and so if you don't have a primary key and you get to use a surrogate key, so that might add up to the memory to store that surrogate key, which is extra column as well, and that has to be maintained over the time, right? So those are the pros and cons of using surrogate key. And let's take an example of surrogate key. So how do you create it, right? So surrogate key will be created in any, like SQL if you take, right? So this is important. So there will be some syntax in SQL. It is underscore increment, and then you give it as a primary key, right? So if you use this one for this customer ID, so then it will become a surrogate key. That means whenever there is a new entry into that table, so this one you need not enter this particular value for this particular record column, you need not enter. So you just enter value for these two, right? Suppose you enter here John K, and you give some email ID at the rate Gmail or whatever. So then, but you will not specify any customer ID for this, right? But the system will assign a system ID for this. If it is like 0 1, it starts with 0, but it can go till, it starts with 1, but it can go till whatever number of records you enter into that particular customer table. So now the important questions is when to use what, because now we know primary key, surrogate key, and we know pros and cons also. And you might started already thinking, and you might have some idea when to use what now. But if you really see, so primary key or natural key, when there is a natural attribute in the data that is uniquely and unlikely to change, right? So let's take example of a library management system where you have a books table, and that books table is having a book ID, right? So if there is a book ID and that is unique, right? So for in that book table, and it is unlikely to change, in that case you can use, consider that as a book ID as a primary key. And there might be one more case where, like when the key carries business meaning that is useful for the queries or reporting, so definitely it carries a business meaning, right? So in that case you can consider that as book ID as a primary key. And then you have a surrogate key when no natural key exists. So you take a example of a, like a insurance management system, so where there is a insurance table, but that insurance table doesn't have a insurer ID or insurance ID. So in that case you are bound to use a surrogate key, because naturally the keys doesn't exist in that cases. So natural keys are too complex or large. So there might be some cases like you have to use a natural keys which are complex. That means you are having a natural key which is, say for example, which is having a combination or composite primary key. So in that case also you can go for surrogate key, using surrogate key. And when the data in the key might change, affecting the referential integrity. So in that case also you can use surrogate key, because there might be, because of some business decisions, if they change the primary key, right? How they are creating the primary key. If that logic changes, so that entirely might impact the referential integrity that other tables are using, right? If the product ID changes, so then if the product is being referred in the customer table or order table or invoice table, so everything will get impacted. So even in that cases, if there is such scenario, so then it is better to go to the surrogate key. And also to improve the performance with simple, small and fixed length keys. So if that is a, if the keys are if you want to keep the keys very simple and small and the fixed length keys, so in that way we better to use surrogate key, and that will help in the performance. So think about all these aspects when you want to make a particular column, or we want to define a primary key or surrogate key, basically a key to uniquely identify a record in a particular table. So this should be the approach. So now that we have understood the conceptually we have understood, or theoretically we have understood what is primary and surrogate key and what are the disadvantages and disadvantages of each and when to use what. So let's take a real-time example, right? So like when you're really implementing or a real-time project, so let's take you are working in a retail management system, right? So you are working for a retail organization where the retail inventory and sales system database is there. And in this case, how exactly you want to define the primary key and surrogate key, right? So let's take an example. So when you talk about retail inventory sales system and sales system, there will be a product table, there will be customer table, order table, and order items table. So you can think of many different tables, but just for the explanation purpose, we have taken um, like a really important tables here, right? And if you take product tables, SKU is nothing but stock keeping unit, so which will be a primary key. It's like a product ID you can consider. So here I'm defining this as a natural key, because that's coming with a naturally it is coming along with the product table. So that's what I'm taking that. And if you take customer table, so we have identified that there is no uniquely identifying record. There is only first name, last name, and email. So that is why we need to just with the first name and last name or email ID, I might not be able to uniquely identify a record. So you might say using email I can uniquely identify a record, but that is not a ID, right? So end of the day, it is better to choose a ID which is an integer, right? So so that any operations if you are performance or if you are performing, that will be much quicker. And if you are choosing the email ID as a primary key, that is not a good practice. So that is why we have chosen here customer ID, which is a surrogate key, right? And there might be other scenarios where I'm using surrogate key even in order table and order item table, so where I don't have uniquely identifying columns. So even I might use combination of customer ID and order ID, right? So in that case, I might try to uniquely identify a record. But again, so as I said, like in the previous section, so we can consider these two and make it as a composite primary key, but that might lead to a performance issue whenever you want to join it with other table and uniquely identify that and do joins, and some you want to try some generate some reports. So then that in that case it might be slow. The system performance might be slow. So that's why it is better to use surrogate key in this case as well. And similarly in the order item case, right? So this is how maybe if you want to really see, like you can just see like foreign key, right? So foreign key constraints, that means so order table is referring to the customer table, right? Because it is having primary key which is referring it. Okay, and order reference table is referring order item table is referring both order ID and product. So it is referring product table and also order table, right? So you can just relate what exactly the relationship between them. but the intent here was to show which are the natural keys and how you choose a natural key and surrogate key, right? So, and we'll quickly jump to the next section where we will see how different RDBMS systems uses syntactically surrogate key. So primary key is quite simple, but we wanted to show how different RDBMS systems in syntactically are different when you are defining a surrogate key, right? So here, if you see, like, it is order ID int, you are mentioning as a auto increment. That is a syntax in MySQL. But in PostgRE SQL, it is like serial. So that is a keyword to use. And Microsoft SQL, it is identity 1 comma 1. That is how you need to define the like surrogate key in each of the different systems, right? Continuing with that, Oracle is, as you can see, it is not straightforward. You need to create a sequence, create sequence, and then you need to mention whether you want to increment by 1 or 10 or 2 every time, how much, by how much value the increment should happen. So then that particular sequence you will refer here, right? So in this order sequence, you are referring here, and you are defining the you are creating a trigger, and you are using that particular orders table, and then you are defining a sequence for that. So it's not so straightforward in Oracle. And in SQLite, you can see again you are using a auto increment as a keyword at the end. So syntactically it is different, but the conceptually it is same, right? And almost all the RDBMS you take, any RDBMS you take, so the surrogate key concept is there, just that syntax is different. That is what we wanted to show, how exactly the syntax might be different. And summarizing the this concept that we have discussed in this video, primary keys, yeah, as we know, it is a natural keys, also called as natural keys, and are ideal when there are stable and meaningful attributes that can serve as a unique identifier. But surrogate keys are preferred in scenarios where natural keys are not too stable, that might change from the business perspective, and they are too complex, so to consider them as a keys, and are not so efficient for the database operations, if it is like a composite primary key, or the data volume is huge, and so that cases the performance might get impacted, right? So during these cases, so we need to use surrogate key where primary key is not so suitable, but always prefer to go with the primary keys first, and rule out that primary key option considering all the scenarios, and then choose the surrogate key. So primary key is always the first preference to start with, and then assess that scenario where it is not able to define it as a primary key, so then go to the surrogate key as a next option. So with this, hope we were able to understand the concept of primary keys and surrogate keys, and what is the difference, when to use what, how exactly we are choosing primary keys, and what are different scenarios. And we also see the real-time example, how in the retail management system, particular tables can be defined as the primary key and surrogate key. So hope this was useful, and thanks for watching.